The promise was simple. After Ukraine, Mali would just be an armed respite, a minor war against poor men, poorly equipped and doomed to defeat. But Volodya Shumakov would discover that empires also bleed in the desert, and that peasants in sandals with old motorcycles and rusty houses could turn Russian arrogance into yet another row of corpses. African sun. Volodya Shumakov was in the middle of chaos, in a situation as bad as his days in Ukraine, but now in the desert of Mali. The Odinim jihadists and the FLA rebels had surrounded the base. The Russian soldiers started cursing and they needed to respond to the chaos that was taking over Mali. He fired in the direction of the enemies, while the Russians and the troops of the Malian armed forces, the FAMA, tried to spread out across the base to prevent the attackers from entering. The gunfire was a constant background noise as the men tried to respond. He had heard about ambushes and how the Tuaregs and Fulanis had dealt with the Wagner Group forces in previous years. Now, in April 2026, he had to fight for Russia's Africa Corps to avoid the same fate. The Russians had to take the initiative since many of the Malians were hiding rather than fighting. Don't ask yourself. They fired RPGs at distant targets, then switched back to AKs to keep shooting and force the enemies to retreat. Enjoy your meal. Malian soldiers pointed at the enemy without raising their machine guns. Helicopters flew over the base while the Russians kept trying to fight back with RPGs and rifles. Appetite. Appetit, appetit. They called for heavy weaponry. The armored vehicles were positioned so that the cannons could start destroying the FLA and Dinim troops that were gathering. After some time, the pressure eased. The Russians left the base to observe the result of the massacre. It seemed like that would be an easy victory against that damned weakness. They found corpses and destroyed vehicles, signs that it hadn't been a very successful moment for the enemies. But that was far from being the whole truth. The story of the Russians in Mali proved that there was much more happening in Mali. Two powerful groups had joined forces. They had fought each other for years, made temporary alliances. But now, their leaders had plotted something much bigger. They sensed the weakness created by the Russians themselves and by the government itself. The Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, or DINIM, was the largest jihadist coalition in the region. Formed in 2017 by the merger of four smaller groups, including the Al-Qaeda branch, Majebre, and the Mazi Liberation Front. Their goal was to expel foreign forces and overthrow Mali's military government, and to establish a state based on a strict interpretation of Sharia Islamic law. The Azawad Liberation Front, or FLA, was a more recent organization. It was formally founded at the end of 2024, after the dissolution of previous coalitions of separatist movements, unlike the terrorists from Dinim. Their ideology was Azawad nationalism. The northern region of Mali, mainly composed of Tuareg and Arab ethnic groups. The fighting had started in April 2006. In a coordinated surprise attack. In the capital, widespread explosions and exchanges of gunfire. in the vicinity and perimeter of Odiboketa International Airport. They forced the immediate shutdown of all domestic and international air traffic. Rebels and terrorists attacked the barracks and fortifications of the main base in Kati, located less than 15 kilometers from the capital, Bamako. The insurgents passed through the inner security ring of the Minister of Defense and Veterans Affairs residence, the prominent lieutenant Sadio Camara, chief architect of Mali's geostrategic shift toward the Russian Federation and Goita's trusted man, the current military dictator of the country. The absolute head of intelligence, General Odibo Kone, he was seriously wounded in combat and evacuated at the same time. Urban and rural warfare engulfed the country from north to south simultaneously. Mobile columns of Dinin carried out assaults on military positions in Mopti and Severe, destroying communication infrastructure and rattling the garrison in the center of the country. Cities like Kidal, Chal, Mopti, Severe, Borem, Bandiara, and Sinu were set on fire by the conflict. Volodya Shumakov deep down knew that this was a tragedy foretold, the terror they themselves had brought upon themselves. Volodya Shumakov fought for 3 years in Ukraine. He faced the terror of drones for months. He stayed in dark, foul-smelling basements. He walked along trails filled with bodies. He felt the cold almost freeze his bones. After that, he was invited to spend time in Africa. I know it sounds easy. He just had to stay at a few bases, shooting at peasants in sandals with old AKs in their hands. He accepted. He signed the contract. And he made a difficult and long journey. After the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the Russians were left without an important ally. And they also lost a key transit point for their operations in Africa. He ended up arriving in Mali, joining a task force of the Africa Corps, the state replacement for the mercenaries of the Wagner Group. There were fewer than 3,000 men. But the commanders said that was more than enough, even though Mali was the 8th largest country in Africa, larger than France and Spain combined, with gold and other important products that the Russians were extracting from Mali. There should be enough troops, but he would probably only think about that later when he was completely surrounded. The worst part is that the Russians and the government of Bamako, the capital of Mali, had done an almost perfect job of isolating the country. They expelled the UN and French troops. They broke the agreement with the forces that would become the FLA, and they still insisted on holding on to Mali. In the same way that the French colonial forces had left it, a country with artificial borders, encompassing ethnic groups that often had conflicts with each other, and it still has access to the sea. It was no wonder the FLA was there, pushing for the creation of Azawad. Now the Russians were trying to react to those troops. Help wasn't coming. Theoretically, Niger and Burkina Faso, two other dictatorships that had come to power under Russian tutelage, they were supposed to help. But Burkina Faso, despite the flashy propaganda around its dictator, it was almost in the same state as Mali. Niger couldn't do anything either. Shumakov only learned in Mali about the fighters' history. In 2023, images showed an attack on Djibé. There were dozens of motorcycles gathering in a continuous advance with AK fire cutting across the desert. Decentralized groups, their mobile units were fast. They moved through the desert and surrounded the Russian and Malian bases. Those numbers and the chaos of the attack, they were recorded by Turkish drones. Bayraktar TB2, which the government had acquired, from the air, they targeted concentrations of fighters, blowing up dozens of men. The survivors ran. But the attacks on Djibé continued. Drones hunted Odinia's scouts, trying to prevent them from gathering more information, from mapping out the combat routes. The Bayraktar's munition exploded among the trees, but some still managed to escape. There were many of them, and not even the few Russian helicopters could handle everything. Other bases were taken, like in Gaul, also in the north of the country. Dinim was getting more and more prepared, even increasing the power of their weapons. Money flowed more freely as more areas were taken over. The group controlled several artisanal mining zones, imposed taxes on miners, and set up ambushes in certain areas. In rural and urban areas, they looted and demanded large sums for the ransom of kidnapped people and foreigners. Control of the north would be important for jihadists and rebels. There was a lot of artisanal mining. But international corporate giants such as the Canadian company Barrick Gold and the Chinese company Kangfeng Liqiu could continue their activities even without the involvement of the central government. As long as they reached an agreement with the local warlords, the Malian armed forces couldn't become a real, truly effective enemy. This became clear during the attack on Diora in 2025. The insurgents were almost reaching the south, leaving the region that would become the Azawad claimed by the FLA. It was a well-planned attack. The drones captured the effort of the Malian troops to defend the location. They ran behind the barricades knowing that the wave of chaos from the jihadists was coming through the desert. The base was large, and there weren't enough men to hold back all the fronts of attack. The jihadists were getting closer and closer. Heavy machine guns fired from the tops of old battered motorcycles after days of wandering until they reached Diora. The crackle of gunfire surrounded the base. The rebel commanders tried to raise their voices above the blasts to coordinate their men. After so many shots, the men of the Malian armed forces gave in without the same drive as the jihadists. They ran shamefully through the desert, trying to survive the gunfire or escape. Makov experienced part of this horror in mid-2025 when some of his colleagues faced assaults on the border with Burkina Faso. The Bolkizi base was quickly surrounded by Odin's forces. Before they realized it, the Russians and Malians were surrounded by hundreds of jihadists. The drone footage was terrifying. The enemies were right in front of the barriers, shooting almost as a form of punishment. There was no way to stop that wave of chaos just by shooting. The drones dropped grenades on the government troops, destroying the few moments when they tried to coordinate their defenses. Some soldiers began to escape, taking advantage of the gaps left by the jihadists. Maybe it was even intentional to show the soldiers that they shouldn't resist to the death. These bases were taken in successive attacks in 2025, the drones observed. Cars helped break through the barriers. Once they got in, only death awaited those who didn't lay down their arms quickly. And even those needed to be lucky. In the end, the jihadists on motorcycles paraded through the bases, looting and taking prisoners. There were huge camps of detainees, mostly soldiers from Mali and Burkina Faso. This was the history the Russians were trying to hide. When they claimed they were killing thousands of denim soldiers per day during the 2026 insurgency, they seemed to be trying to hide the same thing. Rumakov learned that many of the Russian helicopters were protecting the capital and its surrounding areas. After all, in the south was Bovo, less supported by the Russians and home to many of Mali's gold mines. This left the bases in the north very unprotected, and many of them had been surrounded by the FLA and by Denim for a long time. Maps showed how Kidal, for example, was between the two forces. To make matters worse, for months, rebels and jihadists had been destroying the supply routes. Without fuel, even military vehicles were left immobile at the bases. The Russians still tried to hold their ground. The drones targeted the jihadists when they began to gather for the attacks. The explosions shattered the men and their belongings. They chased them across the open field, increasing the destruction among the rebels. Denim, recognized as part of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, and its men were still flesh and blood. They died in the face of Russian technological power. The Russian airstrikes pounded the small clusters of trees without mercy where the rebels tried to hide. The explosions rippled among the trunks, causing more deaths. Tuakov heard that his commanders were trying to break the siege in several areas. Until then, they had to hold out and let the airstrikes take effect. The FLA and Denim forces were...
As forças da FLA e do Dinin
continuously detected. Since they were never alone, the Russians and the government knew that just finding one or two meant there were more fighters coordinated among the weapons. The bombs added even more heat to Mali's dry weather, fertilizing the arid soil with human corpses. With many explosions sweeping through Denim's chaotic troops, the frequent detonations hit isolated targets. But the truth was that Mali was too large, and the Russian and government forces were too few and too inefficient to cover such a vast region with such scattered attacks. Yes, it was true that the Russians and the government were destroying many of Denim's FLA troops. The videos showed the bombs falling and they circulated throughout Mali, but most of them didn't help solve the problem in the north or contain the expansion. They should be considered safer. The newly formed insurgent bases received the same fiery gifts from the sky. The Russian soldiers followed smaller groups and used drones to hunt them. Then they surrounded the enemies among the rocks, demanding that they surrender, but it was a huge effort just to overpower two of them. It wasn't enough to eliminate the insurgents and terrorists. Chumakov saw the heavy weapons being used once again against the insurgents. They tried to resist, but the enemies were too persistent. A Square subscription fee. Made your debut. Gradually, the Russians started to die. Chumakov, mortally wounded after surviving the worst in Ukraine, fell in Mali before poorly armed peasants. And here, another Russian corpse. This time, it was the body of a war veteran who never imagined that the worst moment of his life might happen in those lands. The only option for the Russians was to reach an agreement to withdraw from cities like Kidal, Tessalit, and Aguelhok, something confirmed in Russian groups and other sources. This move handed over thousands of square kilometers of sovereign control back into the hands of the rebels and erased all the hard-fought military gains from the end of 2023. Drone control centers that had been used to massacre the rebels were completely abandoned and shown off by the insurgents as major trophies after they cleared out the fortified bunker. Without a public statement to calm the country, what fueled the government? Rumors of death or escape. Assimi Goita reappeared in a cold and scripted appearance on TV. His first meeting after the attack was not with the high military command, but with the Russian ambassador in Bamako, Igor Gromy, a calculated gesture to reaffirm dependence on Moscow and contain internal risks. Bamako did not fall during those days, and the government of Mali remained standing. Contrary to some rumors, the Russians showed that their presence was real. Forces were still active in Mali, along with the government, intensifying continuous night attacks and the overflight and disruption of Turkish armed drones of the Bayraktar type and helicopters in the Gal area, trying to stabilize the outskirts of the urban zone. But it was a reaction more focused on maintaining the regime than actually stabilizing. A country consumed by chaos, with the north deteriorating further and slipping beyond the central government's influence. Russian military bloggers made the situation in Mali and the other two Russian-backed dictatorships quite clear. He hoped that the stabilization of Mali would finally serve as a catalyst. That would force the governments of the Sahel to focus not only on purely propagandistic initiatives, but on measures that would at least have an indirect relation to strengthening their defense capabilities. But he was wrong at the same point as always: a military response and military reforms. The same blindness and arrogance of the colonizer, imagining that force was the only and easiest answer to the problem. In the end, the Russians, in their anti-imperialist propaganda, were no different from everyone else who had passed through Mali. As long as Malian gold shone in Moscow, it made little difference how many corpses lay scattered in the desert from fire, hunger, pain, or disease.